today's going to stay indelibly on my memory because I've been part of a group where someone said they felt sorry for men. So I don't know what that does with my feminist credentials, but I'm beginning to worry. But I think that is indicative of something that Varys said this morning. I hope I said your name correctly. That men talk and women do, and I think that's so right. If you look at immigrant communities and refugee communities, the women have got together and they have created the agencies that are delivering the services. And now we're seeing, as I'm doing more and more research, men from those same communities saying, but what about me, but what about me? Get up and do it is my message to them. If the women can do it when they've got all of those other responsibilities, get up and make it happen for yourselves. But I'll get off my soapbox now. When I spoke to Beth about what she wanted me to say today, she said she wanted me to talk a little bit about me, which is always uncomfortable, but also some of the work I'm doing. When I introduced myself earlier today, I said I'm not wearing a hat for a particular organisation. I left the Met on the 31st of December 2008 in what I often call the big divorce of my life, not the personal one, the real one. And I was very sad to leave that role because I felt that I had been a success. I had achieved what my parents had come to this country to achieve. Little did I know that actually there's a whole lot more out there. So I'm going to sort of start from that sort of premise. I'm not going to talk about what happened at the Met, I'm not allowed to, but what I will say is that I'm very sad that it came to an end in the way that it did. My father came here in 1956 from what was then Pakistan, although he always identified as Indian. My mother has always identified as Pakistani. My father was, right up until his death, an absolute badge-wearing communist. My mother, a devout feminist Muslim, and how you marry those two things together, I have no idea. Also from very different class backgrounds. My father very working class, my mother middle class. Middle to upper classes, as she kind of constantly points out, because they have so this constant tension in the household that I was brought up in. I'm also the eldest of 6 children, 5 girls, and finally, thank God, my mother got her son. Golden Balls, as he's known at home. And that produces a very interesting dynamic when you have parents who are pushing you to achieve all the things that they weren't allowed to achieve because of the constraints within their own communities. My father's lack of access to formal education because of poverty. My mother, because coming from the class constraints that she came from, purdah was a huge issue, and all her choices were constrained by what was acceptable and not acceptable for women to do. And they came here certainly for a better economic situation, but also to ensure that any children of the marriage could achieve in the best way that they could academically. And when I say we were pushed, boy were we pushed. There were those moments when out of the blue there would be, right, we want your school books, right, we want to see what your grades are, those impromptu visits to my teachers coming home for dinner. Which I don't think was the dumbest thing in the Northeast, but anyway, it was how my parents engaged with them. And then, so that's the kind of background, but it's been interesting today listening to some of the experiences of the differences between migrant women and refugee women. And I've been thinking a lot about that in my own context. Yes, my parents chose to come here, but my father was denied the right to ever go back. In the 70s and 80s, Pakistan became ruled by General Zia, and the army took over, and the real Islamization of Pakistan took place. My father was a communist, but also was a strong social political activist, was exiled in his absence. He hadn't been back to Pakistan since the early 60s, but he was deemed to be a real threat to the country. So was never allowed to go back, was never allowed to be buried there. So, with all of that happening, growing up in the Northeast, being the ethnic minority community in a mining village, that sense of always being the outsider has always been there, and I've been listening in on lots of conversations today, because that's what you do. And that sense is definitely there. I've heard talk of prejudice, be it against Muslims or be it against refugee communities or be it against women, you know, for a whole range of reasons, and Daisy stated those really clearly. I think the journey that we're going into as the people of this wonderful island, we need to stop and think about where we're going to and the lessons that we need to learn, not from 100 years ago, but just from the last 2 or 3 decades. And looking back on our own life experiences, I'm really concerned about what recessions do to people. Having watched the mines and the shipyards and the steelworks close in the northeast, I very, very quickly became aware of difference. The National Front were out marching in the streets, walking through St James's Park. I remember the arson attacks on our home. I remember my sister being attacked on the way to school, really brutally being attacked, because we were the only family that were different. And my father ran a business like a lot of people, my mother worked, and we were somehow seen to be either immune from what was happening to everybody else, or the cause. You've all heard that phrase, you know, come over here, take our jobs, take our women, all of that. And I'm getting hints of that again. I mean, it's been happening, I think, in a lot of ways, certainly to the Muslim community post 9/11 and post 7/7. But I don't think it's restricted to the Muslim community. I think anyone who looks different is going to be in the firing line, and that really does concern me. And anyone who stands up for, and I hate to use the phrase minority group, because Daisy's just talked about women. We're more than half the population, we're not the minority. But women, if women had stayed at home, we would be in the economic circumstances that we're in. You know, women should be at home, staying at home, looking after the children. You know, we don't need to, and then the men can go out and have the jobs. I've actually heard that really recently at a conference I attended. These immigrants coming over here, taking our jobs. The resurgence of all of that is a real issue, and I know for former colleagues in the police who I'm still talking to, it's a real concern for them, certainly. Another thing that really, really worries me is, and again Daisy's talked about the cuts. The cuts panic me on several levels, because one, where is it going to leave us in terms of services? As someone who's worked on domestic violence and sexual violence for coming up to 24 years now, I'm really tired. I'm actually running out of steam and running out of energy of constantly applying for little bits of the cake that are left on the table. I'm sick of being pitted against my colleagues. We're all on the same journey. We're all trying to support women, very often the same group of women, but we're pitted against each other by the powers that be to fight for a little bit of funding. That can't be allowed to continue, and I don't think the domestic violence sector is any different from any other. That can't and absolutely cannot be allowed to continue, and we need to be campaigning, and I think Fawcett's a brilliant mechanism through which we can campaign for getting better funding and better support for women and children in the UK. I'm worried about this notion of a big society, not only because nobody actually knows what it is, but also this sense of faith-based institutions filling the gaps where services once were, so the churches, the mosques, the synagogues, etc., the temples coming in. I was born into the Muslim faith. I still identify as a Muslim, but I do not want the mosques driving our services for that community. I went to a convent, for God's sake. I have experience of that firsthand. I do not want the churches doing that. And the reasons for that, one, I think it's divisive. And secondly, those institutions have very rigid views about what society should look like, whether it's in terms of gender and a patriarchal view of society, or whether it's in terms of sexuality. Some communities also have very specific ideas, notions about race too, and about generations and how they interact with each other. I think we're on a road to an extremely dangerous place if those faith institutions are allowed to take as big a place in society as it appears that they are going to be taking. I've already touched upon sort of the EDL and the BNP, although I didn't name them directly. I do also wonder what's going to happen to the voluntary sector. I've worked in the private sector in terms of delivering legal advice and legal guidance. I've worked in the public sector, in the Met and in local government. I chair a charity, the Domestic Violence Intervention Project, which is based in, works in this borough, but it's based in Southwark. And I'm also connected to a number of other charities. So whichever arena I have worked in, that sector has been incredibly valuable to what I have done. The cuts are real. I'm now in a state where I'm having weekly meetings in some of the charities that I'm involved in about whether or not we're going to survive or how many redundancies we're going to make. If God forbid, if any of those charities go to the wall, who delivers those services? That's a real concern for me, and as it will be for you. We've talked about in the groups having access to services. Having access as an individual is one thing, but if those services aren't there, do we start rebuilding them all over again? There has got to be another way. I haven't got the answer to the economic woes that we're facing, but I do believe there is another way, and we have to get together, and we're going to have to try and work out what that is. The banker's bonus has been used to fill the deficit would be my first suggestion, I think.
They're all migrants we have to support.
But it is a real concern. And coming here and seeing somewhere like this, where there are so many fantastic organisations, I've had the ability this afternoon to network with some really amazing people, and I hope I can stay in touch in the future, because I think we could mutually support each other through the coming months and years. But we have to collectively, as women, come together and have a collective, loud voice that says to this government, we will not be suppressed, we will not be downtrodden, we will not allow you to take us back another 30 or 40 years. Thank you.